There are things happening in theology and politics that are all part of the same process.
So many different accounts telling the same event.
People often didn't necessarily blame the monarchy.
Bodies that had been disposed of.
Used as a scapegoat.
And that group wants to get revenge.
Seen as an enemy.
There can be a cycle of violence.
What can we really do with that 1,000 years later?
My name's Sophie Cabot. I work for Norfolk Museum Service. I'm not a religious person, but I have a lot of Jewish heritage.
Hi, my name is Richard Ettinger. I'm Jewish, and I am a student at the University of East-Anglian.
My name is Alan Finlayson. I work at the University of East-Anglian in the School of Politics, Philosophy and Area Studies, and I don't have a religion.
So as far as we can tell, the first Jewish community in Norfolk were people who were invited by William I or William II immediately after the Norman conquest.
Norwich back then, with the Norman king coming in and taking over, it was a very unstable city. There was a group that was slightly different, that had a slightly different language because they came also from the Normandy. So they knew that they're strangers in a way.
They were invited really as part of the Norman project. So in Norwich, what that looks like is the building of the castle, the building of the cathedral, the market, a lot of big building projects which needed to be financed. And in Christian law, as it was understood at the time, Christians couldn't lend money at interest. That was called usury. Because of that, somebody else was needed to provide a financial service of that sort, and that was the role, really, of the Jewish community. The Jewry in Norwich, so the district where most people lived, was in what is now really the centre of town, around the Haymarket, Hay Hill. It would have been a very noisy environment most of the time. Lots of animals, lots of traders, shouting, conducting business, quite industrial as well, lots of people making things, a real mixture of languages. The Grander people and the Jewish community mostly spoke French, but there would have been some Middle English. There are plenty of Christians living within the Jewry, plenty of close neighbours, so Latin and probably music and bells from the churches, some Dutch or Flemish being taught by traders from across the North Sea. Quite an intense, rich sound environment. The structure of the Jewish community is sort of slightly divided. There's the family of Jernit, which is almost separate as super wealthy. Then more sort of middling moneylenders doing mortgages on property and farmland and business deals. And then a number of people who we really know the least about who probably worked for those families. So it's things like secretaries and scribes, but also as household servants, craftspeople, and supporting the community with their dietary needs and all sorts of things like that. We don't see very much about those people in the historical record, but they must have been there. So there's this word that is translated as property. The Jews are the property of the king. And that can be quite difficult to understand because it doesn't exactly mean slavery as we would understand it in other periods. They're not that kind of property. What it means is that the Jews have a direct legal relationship with the crown that bypasses the other authorities. That can be a bit of a bone of contention because it means, for instance, the sheriff doesn't have power over them, or the church authorities who would have power over everybody else, which probably gives a sense to the rest of the population that they have a privileged relationship.
Jews were seen, or the stereotype exists, that they are in the banking system, working with money. I think they were just not allowed other jobs. They weren't allowed into the guilds, they weren't allowed to have a trade, and when you look at other parts of Europe, it was basically the same.
So the Jews were almost forced into the position of acting as moneylenders. but there generally seems to have been quite a positive attitude to the community and good coexistence for quite a long period of time. It's not until a little bit later on that things start to deteriorate a bit.
So the scapegoat originates as a kind of ritual idea in ancient religion, Judaism particularly, but not only. The idea is to make a sacrifice, that if things are going wrong at times of dearth or just tension, is to kind of load all that onto an animal, onto a goat, and in slaughtering the goat, removing kind of blame, sin, guilt from the community, loading it onto that goat. And that deeply informs Christian theology and Christian mythology. Christian mythology is fundamentally built around the sacrifice, and that sacrifice in turn can relieve us ultimately of guilt and sin and make us able to be forgiven. So that's the sort of theological dimension, but of course we use the term to describe what seems to be a much broader social process independent of religion.
So the story of William of Norwich is often described as being the first blood libel story, and it has some of the features of that trope, but not all of them. The story is based around the idea that Jews might kidnap Christian children, particularly Christian boy children, and murder in a ritualised way. It's important to say it's a story. A supposed discovery of the body of an apprentice, a male child, on Mousehold Heath, and then miraculous events surrounding this body. We are told that this happened in 1144, but actually the book describing these events, The Life and Miracles of St William of Norwich, isn't written until the 1150s or a bit later, so it's not a contemporary historical account. What's really interesting is that the book was written by a monk at the cathedral, Thomas of Monmouth, with the support of the bishop, William de Turberville. Neither of them were local to Norwich. Probably what they were trying to do was create a saints cult. The other big medieval centres in East Anglia, Ely and Peterborough and Bury St Edmunds, all had pilgrimage saints cults, so big shrines that lots of people visited. Norwich didn't have one, so they seem to have been trying to create that.
Tensions, conflicts, anxieties, fears in a community become directed into a single place, a single real metaphorical object or person or group.
And they put this story out there.
And then we say, that's the thing to blame.
It seems like their hope was that people would immediately believe it.
If we punish that group,
probably turn on the Jewish community to some extent.
If we expel that group or those kinds of people,
and also support the development of this shrine,
then all the things that have gone wrong will start to go better.
So the pilgrims would come to Norwich and spend lots of money. And it was really a mixed success. There wasn't an immediate huge backlash. It's not to say there wouldn't have been any individuals with problems, I'm sure there were, but community relations between Christians and Jews are pretty good. And the saints cult in Norwich, although it did developed much, much less than the other more famous ones, never became a big international pilgrimage site. The thing that comes after the blood libel accusation is just one line in a chronicle. It's a chronicler called Ralph of Dis, and he wrote that in 1190, in the spring, all the Jews that were found in their house were murdered, the rest having taken refuge in the castle. This is the period of the Crusades, so there's a lot of new ideas about how the Holy Land should be under Christian control and how Muslims and Jews should be pushed out because they are heretical. They shouldn't be in these Christian spaces, and that seems to then create a similar attitude to Jews living in Christian communities all over Europe, where the Jews of London wanted to attend the coronation of Richard I with gifts, and the citizens of London wouldn't let them into the abbey, and there was fighting and violence there. And it goes all the way up the east coast of England, and very famously there's the death of the entire Jewish community at Clifford's Tower in York. But we didn't know a whole amount about what had happened in Norwich. until in 2011 an excavation of the Chapelfield area where the chocolate factory had been in Norwich. They discovered a group of bodies that had been disposed of in a disused well shaft. 17 people, some adults and some children, men and women, and I was asked to comment on a theory that these bodies might be members of the Jewish community. What happened was that some ancient DNA analysis was done on them and some facial reconstruction work, and it was found that those people definitely were members of the Jewish community. So you can imagine a scenario where in that rioting and attack in 1190, many households chose to run up the hill to the castle and to take refuge inside the castle. And maybe a couple of people thought, nah, it'll be fine. We'll lock the doors. We'll be all right. And they weren't all right. Crusading is very expensive. Going to war in the Middle East has always been a very expensive activity. And so there'd been a huge imposition of taxes repeatedly, again and again and again, affecting the whole population, right from the peasantry to the aristocracy. There'd been repeated additional special taxes on the Jewish community, so the Jewish community had lost a lot of its wealth, and therefore a lot of financiers had to do things like call in loans.
Well, war and conflict is always going to affect people in all sorts of ways, even if they're not directly involved in the conflict. They may still be able to feed themselves day to day, but they're not quite sure where the future is going or how they're going to plan for the future of their families. And that can begin to create a much deeper level anxiety, a kind of fear and uncertainty, which is very volatile.
So there was a lot of financial pressure across the whole community, and some of the blame for that was falling onto the Jews. So a few years later, in 1235, there's another accusation of kidnapping against the Jewish community. And it's a very different scenario. What it seems to be is that a member of the Norwich community had converted to Christianity, and his little son was kidnapped, probably by members of his extended family, renamed with a Jewish name and circumcised. So in a way, what they seem to have been trying to do is kidnap him to bring him up within the Jewish community. But the reaction to those events is very different. There are arrests, there are executions, and there are riots in the city. So we're then looking towards the end of the period of medieval Jews in England. In 1290, the whole Jewish population is expelled from England and Wales. This happened directly by royal decree, so it was a piece of law put out by the Crown, essentially telling us that the Jews were no longer useful to the Crown, and their need for them as moneylenders was completely overcome by their debt to them and their unpopularity. It became more advantageous for the Crown to get rid of the Jews than to have them.
So, of course, what happens in politics is that political actors are also always seeking opportunities.
So some people, wealthier people mainly, would have felt an immediate benefit. Property was confiscated and would have come back onto the market. Debts wouldn't have disappeared. Debts would have been acquired by the Crown and mostly would still have to have been paid off. Other people would have lost employment or lost their landlords or probably been affected by losing their neighbours. But there doesn't seem to have been any kind of backlash against it.
It's hard to say if we can take any key lessons from the history. I think it is very sad that it happened that way it happened. There was a situation in which people were used as a scapegoat, seen as an enemy. But what can we really do with that 1,000 years later?
Since then, there's been a whole process of reburying those bodies in the Jewish cemetery that is used by the current community in Norwich, erecting a commemorative stone there, putting up a plaque where their bodies were found in the shopping centre. So that really brought to a head the need to have a proper public conversation about Jewish history in the city.
Part of the sources of longer term conflicts are people feeling that an external group has harmed them, wanting to get revenge, then that group wants to get revenge, and it can go on and on and on. So there can be a cycle of violence. The less consciously directed process that scapegoating produces.
What we can do, and what I also try to do in my voluntary work, have a saying in what is happening in the world. We want to have a counter-narrative and give space for an identity that is repressed otherwise.
If there was one thing that I would want to get across to people about this medieval history, it's that it's part of the story of every important medieval city. So it ought to be part of the story of Norwich, and people ought to know about it.
I believe that inter-community dialogue is very important, and interfaith dialogue is very important. It cannot solve all the issues, but it is very important to bring people together, to give a room for dialogue. Even if the dialogue is not successful in a way or at the first glance, I think it's easy to accuse somebody who's not your own. And if we come closer together, which is happening right now, we are more international than we ever were, we need to find a way to deal with each other.